I'm Harriet, co-host of the podcast Reading Jane Austen, and this video is part of Virtual JaneCon 2026. I'd like to acknowledge the Camaragal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm recording. I was about 15 when I first read Mansfield Park. I did know going in that Fanny was going to marry Edmund at the end, and it literally never occurred to me to question this. Fanny was the heroine, therefore I liked her. Fanny wanted to marry Edmund, therefore Fanny should marry Edmund. I wasn't all that excited by Edmund, but at no point did I want Fanny to marry Henry because that wasn't what she wanted. And I didn't want Edmund to marry Mary because that would mean he couldn't marry Fanny. It wasn't until a few years later that I realised not everyone felt this way. I came across the book Talking of Jane Austen by Sheila K. Smith and G.B. Stern, written in the 1940s, and discovered that not only did G.B. Stern think that Fanny would have been happier with Henry, but that she genuinely believed at one point Jane Austen had intended the book to end that way, and also that she far preferred Mary and Henry to Fanny and Edmund. I should also acknowledge that I pinched the title of this talk from her chapter. And later again, when I joined the Austen L email list in the 90s, I learned about the Fanny Wars, where any time someone expressed an opinion on Fanny Price, the list became a battleground of pro- and anti-Fanny posts. Over the years, I've thought more about the characters, not just why I like Fanny, but also the complexities of Henry and Mary. So what I'm going to give you in this video is my current thoughts about the four central characters in Mansfield Park. I don't pretend that this is the definitive answer, nor that it's necessarily what Jane Austen intended, although I think we do all have a tendency to feel that the way we react is the way the author wanted us to. So let's start with Mary. For a lot of people, it's like you're Team Fanny and you hate Mary, or else you're Team Mary and you hate Fanny. Back when Mansfield Park was first written, Jane Austen wrote down opinions from her friends and family. There were only 2 references to Mary, but they're quite a contrast. George Knight was interested in nobody but Mary Crawford, whereas Fanny Knight commented on Mary's lack of principle. Well, I'm Team Fanny, but I most certainly don't hate Mary. Someone who does hate Mary is John Mullen, who wrote What Matters in Jane Austen. In a presentation at the Hay Festival in 2014, he said, "Beware, beware, beware Mary Crawford." He describes her as a spider and says that she's the evil woman, which I think is quite an extreme reaction. And going back to Talking of Jane Austen, while G.B. Stern is definitely Team Mary, Sheila K. Smith talks about Mary's faults of character. Her insincerity, her worldliness, her self-interest, her petty dogmatism, her amazing stupidity. But I don't agree with that either. Because in a lot of ways, Mary's a really lovely person. Just think of the time Mrs. Norris is being unkind to Fanny about not acting, and Mary immediately goes and sits beside Fanny and talks to her. It's just a spontaneously kind action that comes straight from the heart. Though it can also be a little bit dodgy. For instance, when she sees Mr. Rushworth's jealousy over the rehearsing, she's proud of herself for saying that Maria has such a maternal air. So she's seen his unhappiness and she wants to soothe him, which again is kind, but she does it by saying something that she knows isn't true, which is a bit unscrupulous. And there's also the time when she's been riding too long and Fanny's been waiting. She comes to Fanny and she apologises very prettily, and she probably does mean it, but there's just a touch of #sorry-not-sorry about it. She's just a tiny bit pleased with how clever and pseudo-self-deprecating she's being, and there's no doubt in her mind that Fanny will forgive her. But still, she can be very nice, and I do think it is quite instinctive. She's also great company, amusing, engaging, raises the spirits of everyone she's around, even Fanny when she's not making her uncomfortable. To a lot of people, she's very like Elizabeth Bennet, and they find it hard to understand why Jane Austen is so down on her. So what is it that makes her different from Elizabeth Bennet? Well, it's her lack of principle, which is a word that turns up a lot in Mansfield Park, and it's tied in with propriety, appropriate behaviour, defined at Mansfield by Sir Thomas. But I won't go off on a long tangent about the interconnections I see in Jane Austen between morality and social behaviour. For all that she's a lovely person, Mary doesn't have the same sense of right and wrong that Fanny and Edmund and Elizabeth have. For example, she's arrived at Mansfield with this transactional view of marriage, where love doesn't really enter into it. We're told that matrimony was her object provided she could marry well, which is like Charlotte Lucas, but unlike Charlotte, she doesn't seem to conceive that there could be a different way of looking at it. There's also the fact that she expresses criticism of her uncle to Fanny and Edmund. Now, admittedly, it seems quite mild to us, and we might be more inclined to frown on Fanny and Edmund for bitching about this behind Mary's back. But the fact remains that we never see Elizabeth Bennet talking to anyone else about her mother. And it also means that some of her jokes can be just a bit dodgy or mistimed, culminating in the extreme stupidity of writing to Fanny that if Tom dies, there will be 2 poor young men less in the world. Amongst a group of people who don't know Tom, this might well raise a laugh, because it's quite clever. But it's not the right thing to say to someone who has been brought up pretty much as Tom's sister. And of course, at the end, she sees the Henry-Maria situation as a social problem that can be smoothed over, whereas Fanny and Edmund see it as a sin. But I don't think we're meant to blame Mary for this. I think we're meant to see it as an effect of her upbringing and education, which is another theme that runs through the book. Right from the start, Fanny has said that Mary's impropriety might be a reflection on Mrs. Crawford, as Mary was entirely brought up by her. And towards the end, Edmund says that her friends have been leading her astray. Of course, Fanny's response to this is to think that she is quite as likely to have led them astray. They have all perhaps been corrupting one another. But at this point, Fanny's in the height of her anger and jealousy of Mary, and has been quite unjust to her. Where I think Fanny really hits the nail on the head with Mary is a bit earlier in the book, where she says that Mary has a mind led astray and bewildered, and without any suspicion of being so, darkened yet fancying itself light. And so I think Mary's story is actually almost tragic, because she is a nice person, and she could have been Elizabeth Bennet if only she'd had a different upbringing. She doesn't even realise she has this gap inside her that should be filled with principle. And yet, without being able to articulate it, she does instinctively recognise and value principle. She turns up at Mansfield with her smart London attitudes and cynical view of relationships, and she decides Tom would be a suitable husband, but then finds she's drawn to Edmund instead. It was very vexatious, and she was heartily sorry for it, but so it was. I think what attracts her to Edmund, rather than Tom, is the foundational principles that his whole character is built on. And even though Mary's friendship with Fanny begins due to the absence of anyone else, I think she does value her. And I also think that if she'd married Edmund, they would have been happy. There would have been compromises, and to be honest, I think most of them would have been on Mary's side. We've already seen her changing her position, and I think she would slowly have come to adopt Edmund's principles, because she does truly love him. Maybe she would have gone up to London for a few weeks every year without Edmund, but she would always have come back and been happy with him. And also, that innate kindness I think would have made her a good clergyman's wife. She likes being nice to people. She would have developed principles and so become the Elizabeth Bennet she was born to be. And all of this would have happened, except that Henry brought it all crashing down. Even at the end, with the insurmountable gulf between her and Edmund, we see that she's had a moral growth throughout the book. We're told that even though she's perfectly resolved against ever attaching herself to a younger brother again, she can't find anyone who can satisfy the better taste she had acquired at Mansfield, whose character and manners could authorise a hope of the domestic happiness that she had learned to estimate, or put Edmund Bertram sufficiently out of her head. And that's just really sad. So that's Mary. What about her brother? Well, I have a lot less sympathy for Henry than I do for Mary. Though I do think that if you put him next to his counterparts in the other books, Willoughby, Wickham, Frank Churchill, Mr. Elliot, John Thorpe, he's by far the most interesting and complex. He certainly has good points. He's great in all social situations, which is why he's so welcome at Mansfield. He can talk engagingly and also seriously. Think about his commentary on acting and his discussions with Edmund about the clergy. Perhaps more significantly, he's also very good with everyone he encounters in Portsmouth. He's not repelled by Fanny's father, or at least not visibly, and Mr. Price takes to him straight away. But when they're going to the dockyard, he won't let Mr. Price just charge off. He makes sure that Fanny and Susan can do their shopping and walks slowly with them. And unlike Tom, who's also great company, he doesn't appear to gamble or drink to excess. However, his relations with women are very problematic. Mary doesn't really seem to believe in love until she meets Edmund, but Henry actively enjoys messing with people's emotions to feed his own vanity. He's deliberately stringing both Maria and Julia along, and he doesn't seem to care that he could be hurting one or both of them. And he treats Maria particularly badly. Even before the play, if you look at the language he uses when talking to her at Southerton, I do not like to see Miss Bertram so near the altar. I do not think that I shall ever see Southerton again with so much pleasure as I do now. He's raising expectations in her that he has no intention of fulfilling. He also taunts her into transgressing when he says, "And for the world you would not go out without the key and without Mr. Rushworth's authority and protection." When Sir Thomas arrives home, Maria is absolutely certain that Henry will declare himself. And when he doesn't, she's too angry and upset to take the opportunity she's given to break the engagement off with Mr. Rushworth. And then there's Fanny and Henry's plan to make her fall in love with him. It's manipulative and predatory. And harking back to Mary, she's continually an enabler of Henry's behaviour with women, showing no care for the harm he might be causing. When Mrs. Grant thinks that Julie is in love with Henry, Mary says coldly, "I dare say she is. I imagine both sisters are." I'm sure Jane Austen deliberately used that word coldly to highlight Mary's care factor zero. And even with Fanny, Mary protests a bit about Henry's plan, but ultimately we're told she left Fanny to her fate. But of course, then it all turns round and Henry falls in love with Fanny. And as with Mary and Edmund, I think we're meant to see that part of this is that she has principles that he doesn't. When he's telling Mary everything that's wonderful about Fanny, the narrator points out that Henry Crawford had too much sense not to feel the worth of good principles in a wife, though he was too little accustomed to serious reflection to know them by their proper name. And everything that he's saying about her is inspired by the knowledge of her being well-principled and religious, which I take as meaning that he's responded to this aspect of her, even though he wasn't able to articulate it to himself. For a long time, I didn't pay much attention to what he says in this scene. Like Fanny, I couldn't really forgive him for what had gone before, and unlike Fanny, I knew how the story was going to pan out. So I didn't really focus on what he's actually saying here. But as we were doing these chapters in our podcast, one of the comments we received from a listener was, "How can you read chapter 30 and not want them to be together?" So I read the section more closely, and it's true. He does say some really genuine things. He recognises her good qualities, not just her looks and her biddableness, but also her brains. But for all that, I don't believe Fanny would have been happy married to him. He is showing signs of changing. In the visit to Portsmouth, where we see Henry at his best, we see he's become more serious about his responsibilities as a landowner. But even then, it seems like he's asking Fanny to be his conscience. He says, "When you give me your opinion, I always know what is right. Your judgment is my rule of right." But I do think Fanny may be speaking for Jane Austen when she replies, "Do not say so. We have all a better guide in ourselves if we would attend to it than any other person can be." He does know what's the right thing to do. He has a greater understanding than Mary, but he's asking for Fanny's endorsement before acting on it. So would he have ever truly developed his own principles? Or is this just another persona, like his acting persona, like his "I'd like to give sermons" persona? A while back, there was a podcast called The Daily Nightly, where the hosts were reading through Mansfield Park for the first time. They were entranced by the scene in which he tells Mary he's going to marry Fanny. They didn't know what was going to happen, and they truly saw him as wanting to change, and they compared it to Darcy changing himself for Elizabeth. Now, I'd never thought of that before, so I reflected on this for a while. And it seemed to me that there are 3 very significant differences from Darcy. The first one is that when Fanny said no to him, he kept pushing, whereas Darcy accepted it. He wrote the letter to justify his actions, but he specifically said he wasn't proposing again. Now, to be fair to Henry, Elizabeth's no was much more decisive than Fanny's, so maybe we can cut him a tiny bit of slack. But he does keep pushing even when he can see she's uncomfortable. The second thing is that he makes sure Fanny knows when he gets the promotion for William. It is a great thing he did for William, but it's clear that his motivation was to get Fanny to look kindly on him. Let's give him the benefit of the doubt and assume it's not to actually create a sense of obligation to himself, but he does want her to be pleased with him, and he wastes no time in letting her know that he did it. By contrast, when Darcy sorts out Lydia in Wickham, it's to save Elizabeth pain, and he goes out of his way to prevent her knowing about his involvement. So Henry is clearly far more self-serving here. But finally, and I think most importantly, both Darcy and Henry are tested on their weakest point, Darcy's pride and Henry's vanity. When Darcy learns about Lydia in Wickham, Elizabeth immediately thinks that her power was sinking. His pride will weigh this disgrace more than her attractions. And then when she learns what he's done, it explicitly says that she was proud of him, proud that in a cause of compassion and honour he had been able to get the better of himself. But look at Henry. The author tells us that had he done as he intended and as he knew he ought by going to Everingham after Portsmouth, then everything would have been good. But curiosity and vanity made him stay for the party to meet Mrs. Rushworth, and when she received him coldly, we're told he was mortified. He could not bear to be thrown off by the woman whose smiles had been so wholly at his command. And so he pursues her, and the rest is history. His weakness isn't lust, it's vanity, and when his vanity is tested, he falls. As with Mary, the author puts the blame on Henry's upbringing. He was ruined by early independence and bad domestic example. But I do think he had more awareness than Mary, and so he has to take ownership of his actions. He made choices and he acted on them. Mary just failed to fully understand Edmund. I think it's fair to say that Edmund Bertram would probably win any least popular Austen hero competition. To be honest, I'm not that big a fan of him myself. He does start out well. The scene of him helping little Fanny write to William is lovely, and she talks of how he helped her to be less nervous when she was learning to ride and looking after her. We're told he was always true to her interests and considerate of her feelings, giving her advice, consolation, and encouragement. Of course, it is slightly condescending, but he is genuinely kind to young Fanny. Overall, he does come across as rather boring and pompous, a prig, if you will. In fact, going back to those early opinions recorded by Jane Austen, Edward and George Knight objected to him as cold and formal, while Fanny Knight didn't think it natural that he could be attracted to a woman without principle. But I think we have to accept that the priggishness and pomposity are part of his personality, and after all, it does show him as very much his father's son. He does seem quite committed to his future as a clergyman, and to the pastoral care aspects of the role. Perhaps it's a bit paternalistic, but that's probably a reflection of the times. But for all of his infatuation or love for Mary, he never wavers in his determination for the church, which does show a level of vocation, or maybe of stubbornness. It's probably during the play that a lot of people really start to lose patience with him. When he first holds out against it and then join in, they see him as a prig who doesn't even have the courage of his convictions. But I think this really depends on what you see as his motivation. He says he's doing it to try and exert some control over Tom, to stop an outsider from being brought in, and to protect Mary from having to do a fairly intimate scene with this outsider. Now, maybe this is all just a rationalisation to justify him in doing what he wants, spending time with Mary. But maybe they are his real reasons, and getting to spend time with Mary is a bonus. The problem is, while we hear all of Fanny's internal thoughts and agonising over the play, we never get inside Edmund's head. All we know is what he tells Fanny. I'm inclined to take him at his word. He does think that he can exercise more restraint on the project from within than from the outside. I do think that spending time with Mary is a benefit which he doesn't acknowledge to himself, but I don't think that's the primary reason for him changing his mind. But since we aren't told what he's thinking, I guess we all have to make up our own minds on this point. The scene where he really goes downhill for me is in the discussion he has with Fanny after Henry's proposal. It is so infuriating the way he just dismisses or ignores what she's saying, or just flat out tells her that she's wrong about her own emotions. Possibly this is what their relationship was like all along, all one way, with him doing the talking and her accepting. But the book has said that he values her. For example, when he sees that she and Mary have become friends, he doesn't consider Fanny as the only, or even the greater, gainer by such a friendship. And when he bought the chain for her to wear with William's cross, he demonstrated an understanding of her taste. Of course, from the advent of Mary, he does start spending less time with Fanny, but he does occasionally notice that he's been neglecting her, and it's arguable that Fanny shouldn't feel she has exclusive rights over him. Although I do get rather annoyed with the way he goes on and on and on about Mary to Fanny. So many conversations with Fanny come back to Mary, either how wonderful she is or how conflicted he is about her. The letter he writes to Fanny in Portsmouth is just infuriating, as so much of it is simply a stream of consciousness on how he should propose to Mary. But he reaches peak self-centeredness on the journey back from Portsmouth, when he acknowledges that Fanny must suffer in being deserted by Henry, and then says, "Think of me." Even at this time, it's all about him. So from a promising beginning, he's definitely dropped a fair way by the end of the book. I think many modern readers have difficulty with his position on a lot of matters. His objections to the play, his criticisms of Mary, his stance on Maria and Henry, all of these can be seen as examples of what Kingsley Amis described as Mansfield Park holding up the vicious as admirable. For myself, although I don't find these particularly palatable, I can more or less accept them as part of him. I have more issue with the way he treats Fanny in the course of the book. But I'm willing to hope, for Fanny's sake, that the year of Mary Crawford was really an aberration, and the love she has for him is not misplaced. And when they're married, he will truly value and respect and listen to Fanny. I choose to believe that because I really want a happy ending where Fanny can grow, not be crushed. If Edmund is probably Jane Austen's most unpopular hero, Fanny is certainly her most divisive heroine. This was apparent right from the start with the opinions Jane Austen recorded. There was actually a fairly large pro-Fanny group, but the anti-Fanny minority was quite vehement. In the mid-20th century, there were a number of significant critical works on Jane Austen, all written by men, that fell firmly into the anti-Fanny camp. In 1940, D.W. Harding said she had a distinct tendency to priggishness, and later described her as a dreary, debilitated, priggish goody-goody and a central failure in a potentially very fine novel. C.S. Lewis, in 1954, said she failed through insipidity, which, you may remember, was also Mrs. Austen's view. Lionel Trilling made the grandiose and patently untrue statement that nobody has ever found it possible to like Fanny, while Kingsley Amis, in 1957, said that she is a monster of complacency and pride who, under a cloak of cringing self-abasement, dominates and gives meaning to the novel. As I mentioned earlier, the Austenelle email list, which started in 1994 and ran through I think to sometime around the 2010s, coined the term Fanny Wars for the vicious fights that regularly erupted over Fanny. In their article, A History of the Fanny Wars, Linda Troost and Savory Greenfield looked through a lot of the online non-academic commentary on Fanny and found that Fanny's passivity, her adoration of Edmund, and her marrying her own first cousin form the nucleus of most online complaints. That article's more than 10 years old now, and while I'd like to see an updated version drawing on BookTok and BookTube, I suspect there wouldn't be a lot of change. Well, I'd like, in a non-warring manner, to give you my picture of Fanny Price and explain why I don't think we should be comparing her to Elizabeth Bennet and despairingly asking the question Kingsley Amis did, what happened to Jane Austen? I'll start by acknowledging that Fanny, like Edmund, is censorious of activities that many of us would consider harmless fun. And this does give her a tendency to priggishness, particularly to those of us who don't share these views. But I can accept that as part of Fanny. Of course, others may not. Because Fanny isn't a complete killjoy. Although we don't think of her as fun, she does have enjoyment from life. We know she likes her reading and her stargazing and her geraniums. I'm sure most of us can empathise with some or all of these. And if she had access to it, I'm sure she would love going to the theatre. She watches the Lovers' Vows rehearsals and gets caught up in Henry's reading. And dancing. In spite of her lack of energy, she loves the impromptu ball, and even more, except for Henry, the main ball. We saw her practising her steps before it began and wanting to go over to the Grants to talk about it afterwards. And remember, William's picture of Fanny, after years of written communication, is not of a delicate flower who needs constant protection, which is what Edmund seems to think, but of someone he expects that the others have seen dancing. Another criticism made of Fanny is that she's too good. Troost and Greenfield quote an internet user in saying, "I agree with you that strong morals and true goodness are traits to be valued, but I would find Fanny more appealing if she had to struggle with staying true to them, as the rest of us do." Now, I don't want to be rude, but I think that this person really hasn't read some parts of the book all that closely. Because Fanny frequently agonises about her actions. When they want her to join the play, she asks herself, was she right in refusing? And she also agonises about her feelings. When Mary gives her the necklace, Fanny thinks that she would rather be obliged to some other person, but tells herself that that was an unworthy feeling. Because I think the thing about Fanny is that she's not innately good. She's actually very judgmental, and she has a lot of bitter and angry thoughts about Mary Crawford. But usually, when she sees this in herself, she engages in a prolonged bout of self-examination to try and determine whether what she's thinking or feeling or doing are morally right, and if not, to try and argue herself into a correct way of thinking. And she doesn't always succeed. I mentioned earlier her thought that Mary Crawford is more likely to have been corrupting her friends than they have her. And then there's her angry thought that Edmund will marry Mary and be poor and miserable. She has these thoughts and she doesn't check them at all. This isn't a particularly attractive side of Fanny, but I think it is very real and believable. Fanny may be good on the surface, but we, the reader, see all the turmoil and struggle that's happening underneath. I'd also like to touch on one aspect of Fanny that I've recently changed my mind about, her behaviour over the play. Because for a long time, I was all, yay Fanny for standing by your principles and refusing to take part in something you know Sir Thomas wouldn't approve of. But now I think that's actually not what's happening at all. Because to really stand by her principles, Fanny would have to do a Julia and walk away from the whole endeavour. But she doesn't. She sews, and she hears lines, and she watches rehearsals, and she actually enjoys it in her quiet way. So really, she's as culpable as Edmund, and without his excuse of trying to minimise the damage. What I think we're really seeing here, and Fanny sees it too, is that she has such a visceral response to even the idea of acting that it overrides her innately helpful disposition. Everyone thinks she's being a killjoy, like Edmund, and even she sort of tells herself it's on principle. But when she's agonising about it in her attic, she thinks it would be so horrible to her to act that she was inclined to suspect the truth and purity of her own scruples. And I think she's right to suspect them. So once again, this isn't saintly Fanny or Fanny the prig, but Fanny the flawed individual who's a much more interesting person. And of course, this leads to the other aspect of Fanny that people rail against, doormat Fanny. And I think this is perhaps true, but incomplete. Because yes, Fanny spends her entire life being helpful to and so exploited by the Bertrams and Mrs. Norris. Because, let's be honest, she has a massive inferiority complex that's been thrust upon her and a crushing sense of gratitude towards them all. Arguably, she could have pushed back a bit more, but too much of that and she would have been on her way back to Portsmouth. Of course, she also has a naturally gentle and helpful disposition. Maybe if she were a bit more like Susan, she wouldn't have been exploited so much. But the fact remains that when she refuses to act, it is probably the first time Tom has ever heard her say no to anything. And of course, this is foreshadowing her refusal of Henry Crawford. In the face of pressure from all sides, including Edmund, and not to mention the enormous sense of obligation she feels because of what he's done for William, she holds fast. I don't think any other Jane Austen heroine is under that kind of pressure. And while Fanny is entirely reactive at Mansfield, once she gets to Portsmouth, she starts being proactive, buying the knife, joining the library to share books with Susan. They may not sound like much, but they show she's not always a doormat. I'd like to finish up on Fanny by suggesting that comparing her to Elizabeth Bennet isn't really helpful, because Jane Austen has two types of heroine, and Fanny's the other type. Elizabeth Bennet, Emma Woodhouse, and even Catherine Morland are heroines who learn from their mistakes and have a moral growth throughout the book. But Fanny's more aligned with Eleanor Dashwood and Anne Elliot. These are characters who don't make mistakes and undergo moral growth, because they follow quite a different storyline. Each one of them is in the situation of being in love with a man they can't have. I like to think of this as the Patience on a Monument plot after Viola in Shakespeare's Twelfth Night. She sat, like Patience on a Monument, smiling at grief. So instead of watching their moral growth, we're watching their strength under suffering and how they survive. But the genius of Jane Austen is that while these three characters are in the same situation and respond in fundamentally the same way, they're also completely unique. Now, I won't pretend that Fanny is my favourite of these characters, because that will always be Anne Elliot. But what we do have in Fanny is someone who's struggling so much harder than the other two in her efforts to behave in an appropriate manner and to regulate her thoughts and emotions. To build on something Lionel Trilling said, himself quoting from Henry James, Fanny doesn't have a grace of ease, she has a grace of difficulty. It's much harder for her, but she succeeds, which is why I think she's anything but a failure of a character. There's actually heaps more I could say about Fanny, but I think I should probably wind it up here. So just to summarise my position on the Mansfield Park Quartet. Mary Crawford is a genuinely lovely person who's been let down by her education and doesn't even realise what's wrong. We can see her as being very like Elizabeth Bennet, but I think it's also important to recognise the fundamental differences. Henry Crawford has many good points, but his defining flaw is vanity. He has no qualms about emotionally manipulating women, And while he does genuinely love Fanny, I'm not sure it would last, and I am sure he wouldn't make her happy. Edmund Bertram is rather problematic as a hero. In some ways, he's a mouthpiece for values and principles that we may not be entirely on board with. He's also spectacularly unobservant of what's happening around him, and he really doesn't treat Fanny very well. He does have good qualities, but in all honesty, I think she deserves better. But Edmund is who she wants, and so I'm behind her in it. And I'm willing to believe that we haven't seen him at his best in the course of the novel and that they will be happy together. Fanny's a fascinating character study. Not entirely likeable, but this isn't because she's too good, but rather because we see all the not good stuff that's happening in her head. And she is so much stronger than a lot of people give her credit for.